Welcome, students, to the second part of the lecture series on the history of evolutionary theory. This one covers what we'd like to call maybe pre-Darwinian thinkers. Much of the ideas about evolutionary theory and the nature and composition of the universe, early on we see, Greeks and Hindus from ancient times and other Roman philosophers as well. They have little blips here and there where it's kind of discussed, but it's not until the earliest concepts from the golden age of Islam that people are really kind of challenging ideas that have to do with predetermined existence and things like creationist ideology. And they actually started 1,000 years or so before some of Darwin's work. So you have people that have come up with a number of ideas. It was really Darwin who solidified that. And before him, we've got a number of people that had lots of pieces to the puzzle, but didn't lay it out so elegantly and so detailed as maybe Darwin. And that's probably why he's so famously recognized and associated with these ideas. But they had been brewing for thousands of years. One of the earliest documentations that we have of individuals that are having ideas about how animals interact with the environment, as well as the pressure that the environment provides for the organism that forces it to adapt. And it is Al-Jahiz at 800 AD or 800 CE Common Era that is thinking about this stuff, and it's written down. One of the difficult parts of Western scholarship is the inability up until maybe even recently to translate a number of different documents from Arabic. And once we have been able to do that, and the West has been able to bring this to the forefront, we're seeing all these amazing things that the golden age of Islam has done for, and which we owe a lot to, for ideas like evolutionary theory. Another Islamic scholar was also talking about how organisms might have common ancestry, at least some type of progression of them. Now, you notice that Aristotle's chain of being looked at lower or lesser and to higher organisms in terms of a progression, but it was still a creationist idea. However, many of the Islamic scholars took this probably correctly, right, to mean that, no, this means that many of these organisms are interrelated. You can see Muhammad al-Naqshbandi at the 10th century, who is talking about how many of these creatures, beginning with plants, and they are coming from celestial bodies. That is exactly how we really describe time today, geologic time, where there's the formation of the universe, and there's the formation of the planets, and then there's life at least on Earth. And the most primitive organisms we have are plants and then animals. You also have Ibn Khaldun, or who we just typically call Khaldun, in the 14th century CE, describing the same ideas that Naqshbandi was discussing 400 years earlier, but he was actually trying to think about different stages, even as you can see here, within plants. So common ancestry, as well as struggle for existence and adaptation, right? The Islamic world was already saying a number of these things that, had all been compiled eventually by Charles Darwin and disseminated to popularly to the rest of the world. But even before Darwin, there were a number of European scholars that were coming up with ideas that were important to lay the framework and to add to these ideas that were closer to the truth and considered now, today, of course, knowledge. But John Ray was one of the earliest to document in the 1600s this concept of biological units, like a species or a subspecies. We can think about the lowest biological unit as a species. And then John Ray was conceptualizing that there had to be something that was a unit larger than that. And we now term that genus. And then we have larger units, therefore, that were developed by other scholars that we'll talk about next. But, John Ray was the one that formalized that idea. And, of course, you have these types of ideas all the time, like when you see a dog. So, for instance, you see a dog, you may not know what breed of dog it is. It could be some mix that you've never seen before, or some really rare breed, but you know it's a dog, right? You know that I can classify it in a larger order of things known as a dog. John Ray came up with this idea, at least put it on paper. It is really Carolus Linnaeus who formalizes the entire binomial nomenclature or system that probably John Ray was thinking of, but Carolus did it to a greater degree and including as many organisms as possible. And not only that, there had to be a classification to include a larger group of organisms, like all dogs, like genus, for instance, but every organism. And he published a document known as the Systema Naturae in 1735. And he's known as the father of taxonomy and systematics, that is, organizing things into named groups and putting them in a chart or a matrix that shows it that it's an interrelated group or system, right? Systematics. And the Linnaean hierarchy, I think he had much less when he first started, but you may be familiar with this when you learned a little bit about biology, how we classify things. A kingdom being one of the largest, or domain or system. Some biologists are actually fighting about this right now. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If we were to do you, right? Humans, kingdom, animalia, phylum, chordata, class, that is mammalia, order, primate. We're going to study primates in the second part of the class. Family, that is hominoidea. You are an ape. You are grouped with the other hominoids, lesser and great apes. Genus, homo, meaning man. Species, sapiens. So you are homo sapiens, but we can actually go to a larger classification of organisms, and they have specific traits that lump you into each one, and we'll go into greater detail about each one of them. But it's really Carolus Linnaeus who named lots of organisms, and he also did his best to fit it into a hierarchy, and we still use it today with many modifications. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is a very fascinating individual. He did coin the term biology, but he was also one of the first scholars to take some of the ideas, at least that El Jahiz had, 1,000 years before, that hey, there's an interaction with the organism in the environment. And if you notice some of the early Islamic writings, they are like vignettes. They're paragraphs that talk about really detailed concepts, but that's it. It doesn't really kind of focus on one subject. And so many of the European scholars, what they were doing is they were writing entire volumes about how an organism interacts with the environment in great detail. And that was what was missing before, as well as continued ideas about creation, as not allowing for some of these ideas to come to the forefront. But it was really Lamarck who came up with one of the first detailed explanations of how an organism evolves and that traits are selected for in environments. His ideas, we now know, are not entirely wrong. And I'll explain a little further in detail why. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck came up with an idea known as the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, why this idea is not completely wrong, well, first, let's tell you why it's not totally right. You have what Lamarck had thought were known as vital essences, that in the organism, maybe something like instinct, that the organism senses a need to use or disuse certain body parts or functions, and it is the use and disuse through the organism's lifetime that actually the characteristic has accumulated or changed, and then that change through the lifetime can then be passed down to the offspring. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck is very famous for a model organism like giraffes, and he used the giraffes in his explanation, that you have a giraffe here in the chart on the right. The giraffe on the left has a short neck. It doesn't really use its neck quite a bunch to get the leaves that it is consuming over its lifetime. It's only going to have offspring that have short necks. Now the other giraffe on the right during its lifetime is reaching and reaching for higher leaves, and it's growing its neck. So because it has stretched and used its neck, it's going to be longer, and then that longer neck is going to be passed down to its offspring. Now, we know this not necessarily be true because traits are controlled by genes. All right, we'll get there. But we know there's a field known as epigenetics, where there are genes that are being turned on and off, even in our mother's womb. We don't know exactly how it works. So Lamarck's ideas and his examples are incorrect. But in principle, we're learning that he's not completely wrong. Another interesting character and scholar and researcher, respected, is Georges Cuvier, a French scholar. He came up with this idea known as extinction. And it sounds ridiculous to us now. But in the 18th century, and even before, when people saw a body fossil of maybe a fish, like let's see they saw a fish in a rock, just its bones, right, the outline of a fish, they actually would look at that and go, oh, that poor fish ran into that rock and died, right? It wasn't until somebody like Cuvier who said, no, that's actually an organism that died probably when this was water, and then the clay and soot covered it, and now those are the bones of it, and it's extinct. I mean, there's nothing like that fish today. And so he began challenging, coming up with these radical notions that the earth was not full and created. I mean, there are subsequent creations. There are, and he was also looking at layers of soil of, different time periods, right? He was like, well, these are different time periods, and they show different catastrophic events that wiped out a single creation, and they are followed by newer and even maybe better creations and improvements. And so catastrophism is not something that can explain all of the variation of life on Earth. We still have organisms that have been living for continuously for hundreds of millions of years. But catastrophic events can explain some of the variation of life on Earth. There are huge geologic eras that are separated by major events that we think are either very large supervolcano eruptions that wiped out 80 to 90% of all life on Earth, and one we think is meteor that hit the Earth 60 million years ago, and that's what killed the dinosaurs and gave rise to mammals. So catastrophism doesn't explain all the variation of life on Earth, but it does explain some. Interestingly enough, it is Cuvier's adversary, Charles Lyell, who probably makes a better contribution. He's considered the father of modern geology because of his Principles of Geology, which I believe was several volume work that was published over a number of years, 1830 to 1833. Charles Lyell challenged Cuvier's catastrophic idea of catastrophism, that these layers of soil are just, put down over and on top of each other. They're not always just complete extinction events. And at the same time, he developed this assumption, right? In science, we have a number of assumptions, and usually over time, we're able to deal with each one of those assumptions, but we still have to assume things. Uniformitarianism is the assumption that Charles Lyell developed, or what he had come up with, which is known as uniformitarian geology. But we assume uniformitarianism in everything we do. So Lyell's idea was that geologic processes work today, they worked similar in the past. And this is how we can interpret different layers of soil, assuming that they were put down in the same way. Basically, because of the gravitational pull of the Earth and particles to it, right, they get laid down on top of each other. And so Lyell suggested that the same process that occurs today, putting down layers of soil, had happened in the past. That's the only way you can compare them. Now think about it. We use uniformitarianism in everything we do. You use it every day. In the morning when you wake up, you assume that gravity, for instance, is going to be the same as it was yesterday. If geologic processes are different in the past, like tens of millions of years ago, we can't compare it to anything today. And so that was a major breakthrough, and we still assume uniformitarian geology today. Charles Lyell also suggested that the age of the Earth was billions of years old. I think he suggested in the number of 10 to 15 billion. It's a little bit too old. But many people, and even some into today, believe that the Earth is 5,000 to 6,000 years old. They didn't think that there was enough evolutionary time between the similarities that they saw between apes and humans, that there was enough time for those number of changes, because we look radically different, to occur. But once Charles Lyell, who was the big authority on geology, said, no, I think the Earth is much, much older, then people started to think, oh, wait, maybe there is enough time for the evolutionary change between apes and us. Thomas Malthus is a figure we owe much to because he's basically the father of modern demography. He wrote an essay on the principle of population, and what he laid out was a framework like Malthusian demography that still really hasn't been refuted. And we look at how Malthus's ideas, if we have good data, how they can actually be very useful when trying to interpret competition for research sources among differing groups of species or between species. What Malthus had noticed was that, populations, of course, they increase exponentially. An exponential curve is if you were to every generation or every year double or square something, you would effectively have a curve that looks exponential, which is the blue curve here on this graph. Human population increase exponentially in this case. But food does not. Food is something that's incremental. And if you can think about, right, exponential population size, if food is not exponential, then it is going to limit the population size. And this leads to a competition for resources, in this case, food. These ideas inspired Darwin and Wallace. And so Malthus was very, very influential for Darwin because this gave him the fodder in order to develop a very sound thesis that was based mostly on competition.